Welcome to another supplemental, folks, and this is quite an old subject we're going to be tackling today, but it's still one which comes up in my videos, which is the accusation that Star Trek Deep Space Nine is a ripoff of Babylon 5. Now, I will assume if you're watching this video, you are at least familiar with both shows, so you know the stories, you know the setting, you know the characters. They're both sci-fi shows primarily set aboard a space station. We won't really go in depth in terms of recapping what both shows are about. What I do think needs a refresher is the exact timeline of the creation of both shows, because that's really where the controversy comes from. So Babylon 5, of course, was created by J. Michael Straczynski, and when he was first getting Babylon 5 off the ground, he was touring it around lots of different Hollywood studios, and one of the first places he toured it was Paramount Pictures. Now, he was touring around with a couple of pieces of documentation. One was the show's Bible, the outline for the first season, and the completed script for the pilot, which became The Gathering. Now, he showed this to Paramount Television, who of course produced the Star Trek shows, but Paramount, after the pitch, said, no thank you, we're not interested, and J. Michael Straczynski moved on to somewhere else. And by the time JMS had secured a deal to produce Babylon 5 with Warner Brothers, Paramount announced Deep Space Nine. And J. Michael Straczynski has always speculated that Paramount executives basically used his pitch for Babylon 5 to sort of steer production of Deep Space Nine with a bit of a nudge and a wink. However, it is worth noting that J. Michael Straczynski these days calls all of this water under the bridge, and there's never been any legal action taken between either party. But that hasn't stopped some very rabid and passionate Babylon 5 fans from crying foul and calling Deep Space Nine a ripoff. And this is another one of those cases where the term ripoff is just used so broadly that if you were to apply the same logic to other works, it would essentially prevent any new media being created at all. So let's clarify for a second. The Babylon 5 pilot script was a little different to the show itself. The Gathering, which was the pilot movie, I've covered in another video. But in this pilot movie, there was no Susan Ivanova and there was no Dr. Franklin, and characters like Delenn were a little different. And I point this out because when this subject comes up and comparisons between the two shows are made, I've seen some folk make the rip-off argument by comparing certain characters, notably Susan Ivanova with Kira Nerys. They say both are hot-tempered first officers, and clearly Nerys was inspired or ripped off from Ivanova. But this isn't really true, and it actually can't be true, because Susan Ivanova didn't actually exist at the time J. Michael Straczynski was pitching Babylon 5 to Paramount, and instead Lieutenant Commander Takashima is the character who is the first officer in The Gathering. And if you've seen The Gathering, that character is not hot-tempered at all. And there are a lot of other differences between Nerys and Takashima, which kind of leads us into the subject of other character comparisons. If you say, well, the first officers, okay, maybe they're not the same, but what about the commanders of both stations? Here we have Jeffrey Sinclair and Benjamin Cisco. Now, Sinclair, when we start Babylon 5, is a hero of the Minbari War, and he's kind of that classic chisel-jawed hero ready to take on his new assignment of running Babylon 5, and that's not Benjamin Cisco at all. Benjamin Cisco starts Deep Space Nine kind of a broken man. He's recently widowed in the opening battle at Wolf 359, and he's a single father raising his son, and he's kind of in a bit of a low place at the start of Deep Space Nine, and he's contemplating leaving Starfleet, and he sees Deep Space Nine as sort of a backwater assignment. And that's actually a really important difference as well between the two shows, is the context of both settings. In Babylon 5, the station itself, is a very important diplomatic and commercial hub for the galaxy, whereas Deep Space Nine is a backwater assignment, it's a backwater post. It's run down, it's derelict, and it's only really made important kind of by accident. If it wasn't for the wormhole showing up, it's probably likely Cisco would have, left Starfleet and gone somewhere else, and Deep Space Nine would just kind of be a footnote in history. But it's with the emergence of the wormhole and everything that happens with the Dominion, it becomes super important just by accident. But it was never intended that way. And that's a really important difference between the settings of both shows as well. But as we're doing character comparisons, how about the chief of security of both stations? What about Odo compared with Michael Garibaldi? Now, Garibaldi is quite energetic as a personality, and I don't quite know what his age is, but he has a kind of a young energy to him, and he's quite sarcastic, and he's very quippy. He has that kind of Bruce Willis-like energy, and that is not Odo at all. Odo is a very curmudgeonly alien. Again, I'm not quite sure how old Odo is, but he has a very, very old demeanor, and he has a very short fuse. He gets angry quite easily, especially with Quark. Now, regarding Odo, J. Michael Straczynski once brought up the shape-shifting aspect of both first episodes, when he referred to the Changeling Net. But in Babylon 5 The Gathering, the Changeling Net is a device which an assassin uses as a disguise, whereas in Deep Space Nine, Odo is a natural shape-shifting alien. And I also want to point out that neither shows invented the word changeling. Changeling is quite an old word. So yes, while there may be a little bit of shape-shifting in both stories, the context is completely different, and how the shapeshifting works practically in both stories is also completely different. So if not those characters, what about the medical officers of both shows? Dr. Bashir versus Dr. Kyle. Remember, not Dr. Franklin, because Dr. Franklin was invented after The Gathering had already aired, so Paramount didn't see anything of that character. And again, these two characters are completely different. Bashir is a very naive, young officer. He's just starting out as a chief medical officer. You get the feeling, I'm not quite sure, I'd have to look this up, but you get the feeling that he's not that long out of the academy. Whereas Dr. Kyle is clearly a much older man. He's very seasoned, and his personality is much more reserved, whereas Bashir has that kind of wide-eyed optimism in early Deep Space Nine. And in terms of other character comparisons, there is no Jakar and no Londo equal in Deep Space Nine. There are no regular ambassador characters at all in Deep Space Nine, because again, the context, the function of both stations is completely different in their stories. There's also no bartender character in Babylon 5, so there's no comparison to Quark either. There's Lita Alexander, and the only possible comparison I think you could remotely make is between Lita and Jadzia Dax, and again, they're nothing alike whatsoever. The only thing which connects some of these characters is their general occupation. None of them really stack up as direct comparisons to each other. So the characters are a bust. It's pretty ridiculous to say any of these characters on Deep Space Nine are rip-offs of any of the characters on Babylon 5. So the characters are a bust. But what about the stories? Now, at first glance, this seems a bit more damning, right? Both shows have lots of plots, lots of episodes about, crime on the station and diplomatic events and envoys and things, which, assassination plots and so on. And both shows also end up becoming these big epic space operas with a war storyline. Babylon 5 has the Shadow War and Deep Space Nine has the Dominion War. But on closer examination, this only really makes sense if you're writing stories about a space station. Say you're a writer for this show. You have a sci-fi show, it's set aboard a space station. What kind of plots fit the setting, which aren't just, a soap opera in space? So there's lots of coming and going on a space station, lots of ships docking and departing and things. So obviously that will be a hotbed for smuggling and other crime, and that makes sense for that to be the plot of a lot of episodes, is criminal activity. In sci-fi setting, a natural kind of meeting place for important figures would also be a space station as opposed to a planet. So, diplomats coming and going and assassination plots and so on, that also just makes perfect sense if you're writing a show set on board a space station. And what about the importance of the station itself? It can't really go anywhere, so it has to become valuable to other factions. So if you're writing that show, how would you make the station important? Well, it would have to be some kind of important strategic point in a war, perhaps. Or it needs to be a place that some kind of faction wants to take over. So again, making both shows a space opera makes sense if you're just writing a show which has a space station as its primary setting. Although it's worth pointing out that Babylon 5 is actually not strategically important in the Shadow War. There's never a moment where the Shadows send a big fleet to take over Babylon 5. But with the Deep Space Nine, the station itself is actually incredibly important. It's the key to the Alpha Quadrant, and is basically the thing that guards the wormhole and stops other Jem'Hadar reinforcements and so on getting into the Alpha Quadrant. So again, that's an important difference between both settings. All that being said, the characters, there's not really any one-to-one comparison you can make between the characters in Babylon 5 and the characters in Deep Space Nine. So what exactly is left to compare? And the only really big similarity that there is that Both shows happen to be set on a space station. But that's not an idea that's unique to either show. That's just a sci-fi trope. And a lot of the other minor comparisons I guess you could make really just come under that kind of umbrella of, well, that's just a sci-fi trope that's in most sci-fi shows and is not unique to either one. So to accuse one of ripping off the other based on those tropes is just kind of silly. So just like my previous Ripoff video, where I talked about, stop calling everything a ripoff when I was talking about people calling Season 3 of Discovery a ripoff of Andromeda, I point out how if you applied this logic to other shows, then everything would just be a ripoff. And I can use some examples, but I want to stress here, in the examples I'm going to list, because people always misunderstand this, I am not calling Babylon 5 a ripoff here. I am using the same logic that people use when they call Deep Space Nine a ripoff of Babylon 5, and applying that to Babylon 5 itself. And if you apply that same logic and that same absurd standard to Babylon 5, then you have to call Babylon 5 a ripoff, don't you? Let's go through some examples. For example, J. Michael Straczynski has mentioned the Lensman series as a big inspiration behind the show. The Lensman series by E.E. Smith, if you haven't read it, chronicles two ancient alien races who fight a proxy war by influencing younger races, which very much resembles the dynamic between the Shadows and the Vorlons. But that's kind of general. Here's something more specific. The novel The Demolished Man. Stop me if you've heard this one before. This is a world where telepaths exist and are ranked by ability, with senior telepaths able to overwhelm junior telepaths and so on. Telepathy is an inherited trait, but it can remain latent in many people. Telepaths also have to register with a guild, as it's called in this book, which trains and oversees telepaths, but some telepaths refuse to submit to the guild and become fugitives. The author of this book is Alfred Bester. Now, again, I am not calling Babylon 5 a ripoff. I am using the same logic those who call Deep Space Nine a ripoff and applying it to Babylon 5. And as I think is pretty apparent, if you apply this standard to Babylon 5 or any other TV show or movie or just story media in general, it basically just stops new things from being made. Also, concerning the story about what might have happened behind the scenes in the creation of both shows, I should say there's absolutely no proof of any of this, and all the accusations are speculative. If you want to condemn Deep Space Nine because some Paramount executive somewhere might have said, hey, this Babylon 5 show is set on a space station, maybe we should set our new Star Trek show on a space station too. If you want to condemn DS9 for that, that's a bit silly. Now, someone will obviously, react to all of this by saying, but Babylon 5 is still better, Deep Space Nine still sucks. But that's not really what we're discussing, is it? I'm not saying you have to like Deep Space Nine, but saying you don't like it because it quote-unquote ripped off Babylon 5, for one thing, isn't true and doesn't really make much sense. And really, you should just enjoy Babylon 5 if you like it better. Deep Space Nine doesn't stop you enjoying Babylon 5. It didn't stop Babylon 5 being made. So yeah, if you don't like Deep Space Nine, calling it a rip-off is just kind of unproductive and untrue, and it's just a useless kind of waste of time, and is just kind of a silly topic that holds no water whatsoever. Me personally, Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5 I think are joint in terms of my favourite sci-fi shows ever. So I'm very happy with both. Thank you for watching. If you like these videos, subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay up to date on my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my patrons or my YouTube members, where you can see videos early as well as some other exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.